Welcome to the Hope After Child Loss podcast, where we endeavor to offer stories of hope to grieving parents and siblings so that they might rediscover life filled with meaning, purpose, and hope. We invite you to come and join us. Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us for today's episode of Hope After Child Loss. I'm your host, Greg Buffkin, and my guest today is a noted speaker, the author of a book entitled Walking Through Fire, a memoir of loss and redemption, as well as a devotional entitled The Scars That Have Shaped Me. She's a regular contributor to Desiring God and has been featured on Family Life Today, Johnny and Friends, and Christianity Today, just to name a few. Let me welcome my guest, Vaneetha Risner, to the podcast. Vaneetha, it's so good to have you with us today.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to be here.
Well, great. Why don't you before we go any further, why don't you just take a minute or two and tell us a little bit about what your latest project is or projects are, and a little about your family, if you'd like to.
Sure. Well, right now I am working on a devotional for B&H Publishing, and that should come out sometime next year, so in 2025. So I am right up against my deadline. So as you're listening to this, I'm feverishly working on that. And so that's my latest project. And I have a few other projects right after that. I have two daughters who live in North Carolina. They're both married, and they both live pretty near us, which is really fun. They both met their husbands in their small groups at their church. So they all know each other, and we have Sunday dinner every Sunday night, which has been a real joy. So
nice.
Both my daughters and their husbands come. And so that's been a really fun tradition that we've had.
Wow.
My husband has two daughters. They live farther away, but we're hoping they'll move close, so then we can have everybody there for family dinner.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Such a rare tradition in our culture today.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for updating us. And Vaneetha, in your book, you open up about a life marked by very deep loss. And your friend Ann Voskamp describes it this way. When I first met Vaneetha Risner almost a decade ago, her divorce had just been finalized. And we talked about how God had radically transformed her through suffering. Her story, which she tells in her memoir, Walking Through Fire, is one of deep loss, contracting polio as an infant, being bullied as a child, suffering multiple miscarriages, burying a son, dealing with escalating weakness that will end in quadriplegia, being betrayed and abandoned by her husband, and yet her story is much more than that. It's the story of our God who meets us in our pain and is using every heartache for something bigger than we can ask or imagine. Wow, that speaks volumes. Your life truly has been marked by suffering. You know, Vaneetha, the focus of our podcast is primarily focused on the loss of a child. Mm-hmm. And that certainly for the parents is an incredible degree of suffering and pain. You've experienced that as well as a lot of other sources of suffering. But let's talk a little bit about your infant son, because I remember in a conversation we had previously, you said that you lost him due to a physician error. Could you expand on that just for a minute or so?
Yeah. So my son was born with a hypoplastic left heart, and we knew before he was born that he had that condition. So he had surgery at birth in out of state at one of the best hospitals and doctors who did that procedure. And he did beautifully through the procedure. So we brought him home and had a little bit of a rough start, but after a while he was doing beautifully and we took him in for a checkup, and his regular doctor was not there. And so there was a substitute, and he just looked at Paul and said, wow, your son is doing so well. Like, he doesn't need all this medicine. So Paul was on medicine sort of around the clock at that point. And so we had these little syringes, and we would just give him a bunch of medicine, orally. every few hours. And he said, oh, he doesn't need that anymore. I'm like, you don't need to fill those. So we were thrilled thinking, oh, wow, we don't need to give him all this medicine. But it turns out that we did. And he was not familiar enough with Paul's condition. And he was just looking at the fact that he was thriving. And so he didn't refill the prescriptions, and we didn't really ask a lot of questions then. We were just so excited. I have a friend who's a pediatric cardiologist, though, and I called him that night just saying, I just want to tell you this great news. And he said, wow, you probably shouldn't have done that. And I really wasn't sure what to do at this point. Like, this is Friday night. So I assumed I left a message at the doctor's office, but didn't think, I thought if they call me back, I can talk to them, but I didn't really want to go to the hospital because I didn't even know what to say. I didn't know what medicine he needed. So I thought we could wait. And so Sunday night, this was on a Friday, and then in the middle of the night on Sunday night, Paul screamed and went limp in my husband's arms. And he went with him we called 911. Dave went with him in the ambulance, and I stayed at home. And Greg, I think we talked about this. I got on my knees and I begged God not to take Paul's life. I mean, I just felt like I will do anything. And at that point, I didn't realize that maybe Paul's life was in the balance. I thought, okay, this is going to be a big problem. Maybe we're going to fix this. And so I felt a lot of hope when I went to the ER. A friend of mine came by and stayed with Katie, and I felt hopeful. And so it was really, really hard walking into the emergency room. And basically the nurse said, I'm sorry, your son is dead. And that was this kind of shocking moment. Like, I couldn't even process it. And I'm sure, most of the people listening to this know what that feels like. Like, when the unthinkable happens, it takes a while to even get your bearings on what was just said.
Yeah. And he was how old at this point, Vaneetha?
He was almost 2 months. So he was a little over 7 weeks.
And did you already have children at this point?
Yes. So I had a daughter, Katie, who was 2.5. And I had already 3 miscarriages.
Yeah. I remember reading that you had multiple miscarriages. Mm-hmm. So you already knew the pain of loss. But, when you've had miscarriages, because we experienced that as well in between our 2 children. And, when you experience something like that, you kind of think, well, wow, we've been through this already. So you get pregnant again and everything is going fine. And it's like you breathe a sigh of relief. And everything's going to be okay, and we've got this behind us. And to frame this, I believe at this point you already had been diagnosed with post-polio syndrome. Is that accurate?
I was diagnosed after Paul died. So at that point, I was not diagnosed with that.
Okay. Well, that's enough. I have to carry that. So you guys are in shock at this point. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that there's also, once you discovered that had these conversations with these other physicians, once the shock wore off, I'm sure that you were experiencing some level of anger towards the physician who made such a tragic mistake. So, you've then got a funeral to plan and all that goes with that. And that's just impossible for a parent. And you've got a young child to be looking after. So what do you do at this point, Vaneetha? How do you walk through this after walking through the pain of those miscarriages?
Well, it was interesting, Greg, because before Paul died, I was teaching a Bible study. And I remember we decided to read a book together. And we read the book, What Happens When Women Pray by Evelyn Christensen. And in the book, she says, God never makes a mistake. And I remember reading that line thinking, I don't know if that's true. Like, it seems like there's lots of things that happen. God makes mistakes. But then I remember thinking, what do you know about that? And then you go on to read in the book that she had 3 miscarriages, a stillborn baby, and an infant who died at 7 months old. And you think, okay, you understand suffering. So her words, even before Paul was born, they were kind of ringing in my head. God never makes a mistake. So at Paul's funeral, Dave and I got up and said, God never makes a mistake. And at that point, Greg, I completely believed that. I thought, God is going to use this. God is good. We were surrounded by friends and family and the church. And so it felt like God is going to carry us through. And God did carry us through. But I would say a few weeks after Paul's funeral, I wanted to pull every one of those words back because it felt like God was not good to me. I heard somebody once say, I believe that God is good, but is he good to me? And that was really my question does God love me? Is God good to me? How can God do this in the midst of my being faithful? Like I thought, if you're a believer, you're gonna have an easier life. And then I'd already had a few miscarriages. And so this just felt like God had really let me down. And so I pulled away from God pretty far. I wouldn't say I walked away because I knew God. And I feel like it's pretty hard to walk away from somebody you know. But it's almost like a relationship where when you're really upset, you may not leave permanently, but you don't look at them. And it's sort of like, you drop your eyes, you don't want to have conversation, you don't want to talk, you don't look at them. And that's what I would describe my relationship with God at that point was I'm not going to look at God. And that went on for a long time. I really can't even tell you how long, but it was a long time.
Yeah, I think that's very common, Vaneetha. And I think initially, we say things and we are in the midst of shock, and how we process in that early period can be very different than when that shock begins to wear off. And something you said a moment ago too reminds me that, I think sometimes as Christians, we have this view of life sort of as a formula that if I, and you fill in the blank, then God will, and you fill in the blank. And when you come up on something that's so unspeakably tragic and traumatic, it puts that to a test. Mm-hmm. And we discover that life with God is not a formula. It is what you described a moment ago, a relationship. If you have that foundational relationship, it can get very tense and ugly for a while even, but it can survive it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it might take a long time, like you were just describing, because I'm not sure how far along into this process, because grieving a child, it takes a lifetime. I mean, honestly, it takes a lifetime. But sometime after that, as if that weren't enough, your husband left you and your children.
Yeah.
And that is another sense of feeling betrayed, because what I think I'm hearing you say is that you felt betrayed by God. And now you've got a husband who's betrayed you, and you're suddenly left with carrying your grief and having to care for children. I can't imagine what that must have been like.
Yeah, that was about 12 years after 12 years. Yeah. After Paul died. So Paul died in 1997 and Dave left in 2009. And at that time, so I had a daughter after Paul. So I had two daughters, ages 10 and 13 at the time. Yeah. And that was actually maybe 14. That was really, really, really hard for me being a single parent, just trying to make sense of what had happened in my life. But I'll have to be honest, Greg, after God met me after Paul died in these incredible ways. And that made all my subsequent suffering, I was able to put it in a different category. Like I no longer was saying, God, do you love me? I did scream at my pastor though, saying, why does God hate me? Because I felt like God hated me. But through that time, I never really turned away from God. I didn't lean away. I didn't look away. because I knew that Jesus was the only way to find life. And I had found it in him through other struggles. As you mentioned, I was diagnosed with post-polio syndrome. And so I had been through a lot of deep things and found God faithful. So there was parts of Dave leaving that were excruciatingly hard. And I would say the hardest time in my life, because I was a single parent with a debilitating condition and angry children who couldn't understand things. And I felt like my life had fallen apart. And yet I knew that God would never leave me. And I found comfort in God's word every day. Whereas I would say for the longest time after Paul died, I felt like I was alone. Like I was not doing this life with God. I was doing this life
Yeah.
on my own. And so there's parts of Dave's leaving that made that the sweetest time in my life because I depended on Jesus for everything.
Yeah.
And so, it's funny how when you look back on your life, there's the really, really excruciatingly hard things. And then for me, as I reflect on them, how did God meet me in them ends up being how I look back on them as markers in my life. And I would say the hardest things in my life are all markers of different ways that God showed me something about himself.
Yeah. And I remember reading that you said when you were 16 that you met Jesus and it changed everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you had that foundation going into all of the suffering that you experienced. So even though it got tense for a while and strained for a while, he carried you through it, and your relation, and he did a lot of healing over that course of time and still is doing that, of course. When we go through things that are that traumatic, it has a tendency to change us as people. Any one of those things that you've experienced, but the death of a child can fundamentally change people, not your personality. That's not what we're talking about. But, when you talk with parents who have lost a child, they will quickly tell you in retrospect that they're very different people at some point after than they were before. What did that look like for you, Vaneetha?
Well, I would say, on the front end, I was a different person because I didn't feel close to God as I had before Paul died, or at least I felt so distant from God. But I would say in the long run, it drew me closer, recognizing that God is always going to be there and God will never leave me, and just sensing his presence when I cried out to him. So it definitely deepened my faith going through that and even drifting from God and then finding God faithful in the midst of that. So I'm a different person because I think my faith went from, okay, I know the right answers. I can teach Bible study. I can study the Bible. I know these things academically. And you go through the fire and they go from academic to experience. So they go from an idea of truth to something that is so firmly grounded. I kind of see suffering as the lab. Like we read the Bible, we come to faith sometimes as a little bit academically, like we understand the truths of the gospel. We read the Bible, we understand it. So we're kind of in the lecture. Like it makes sense. We agree with it, we care about it, but the lab is where we really understand it. Like if you look at chemistry class, you get into the lab and it's like, okay, all those things I read about, now they're true. And I can see that if I mix these two things together, that this will happen. And I feel like I had read about the comfort of God and the faithfulness of God and all of those things, but it was through suffering that they became real.
Yeah, it does have a very purifying effect, does it not? And, Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble, but be of good cheer because I've overcome the world. That's a process, and it doesn't feel good when you're in the middle of that fire. But as you have been sharing, it does have a fire has a purifying effect. And if we just hang in there with him through that process, a better version of us will emerge, I think. But we have to lean into him, and we have to cooperate with what he's doing in our life. I think he will use our suffering in the lives of other people. We become more compassionate, and I think we become kinder people. And I think that suffering God does not waste.
I agree.
Yeah. Now, I do want to touch on something that you and I talked about on a phone call that we had. And this is something that I think a lot of grieving parents really struggle with. And that is sometimes the insensitive and careless statements and expectations that people levy upon us when we're in that grief process. I think most people have the best of intentions, but sometimes they don't really stop and think about what they say. What was your experience like with that, Vaneetha?
So many different things I can remember. I remember just even at the funeral, people don't know what to say. So I heard several times Romans 8:28, which is all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. But I mean, that's a great verse, and I've taken great comfort in that. But that is not a verse to say to somebody at the funeral, because in some ways it's like, hey, you can't even be sad right now because God is going to use that. And that's really not what you want to say to somebody who's grieving. So that was a little hard. And then people would say heaven needed another angel. Well, Paul's not an angel. And so, sort of those comments were a little interesting. And then after Paul died, in terms of, well, this is after Paul died, but after the funeral, I remember I was working part-time, and a coworker came into my office and said, hey, I know this is hard. My wife and I, whenever we have to put down a dog, it's really hard for a while, and then we're okay. And I thought, okay, wow. I didn't really have a lot of words for that. And recognizing that people are meaning well, they're coming from their own understanding and they're trying to do something. And I do applaud doing something, because a lot of people do nothing. Like, they avoid you. And I'm sure you've had that experience. You see people, and right after some tragedy happens, they don't know what to say. So they pretend like they didn't see you, even though you both know that you saw each other. So that's painful too. I feel like ignoring is very painful. And I think people don't know what to say. So they end up saying things that they think will be comforting, but they can be really painful. I remember people saying, like, a few months after Paul died, hey, it's good to see you. I saw somebody out, and they were like, I'm so glad you're over that. It's like, over that. Like, you don't have words for those things. So you just say, okay, Lord.
Yeah, I think those are unfortunately very common experiences.
Yeah.
I had a friend just yesterday, or day before yesterday, who shared a very similar story, that he and his wife just really needed to go ahead and get over the loss. They weren't able to go to something they had been invited to. And somebody said, you guys just need to get over this. That's like giving somebody who is in deep pain an assignment. This is something you have got to do. When the truth of the matter is, I think you can probably identify with this. There are days early on when, if you get out of bed and get a shower, you've accomplished something.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't realize the physical impact that it has, let alone, I think everybody will remember when we went through COVID, the brain fog that people talked about. When you're grieving, there's also brain fog.
Yes.
And it affects the way that you process. It affects the way that you react. It affects everything about you, doesn't it?
Oh, it absolutely does. I mean, you feel like you're in a fog, and you almost think, like, why is the sun coming up? Like, why? I remember going places and thinking, my world has stopped dead. How are other people, like, the world is going on? Like, it just was incomprehensible to me. Like, even figuring out what I wanted to eat or if I wanted to eat. I mean, those things were monumental,
Yeah,
and I had a young
absolutely.
daughter to take care of. And I mean, that was, I really, poor thing. I have no idea how she even got food because, I don't remember giving her food. You just don't want to get out of bed. So when you said get out of bed and
Yeah.
take a shower, I'm like, shower? Wow. I don't think I thought about that for a long time. I was like, getting out of bed was the big part. So
Yeah. Yeah. Common stories. And, what would we have people do? Because we both lived on the other side of that prior to it happening to us. And I know that there were times in my life when I didn't know what to say to somebody like that. And sometimes, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I would have also avoid them because I didn't know what to do or what to say. We actually can learn a lot from the book of Job. Going back to a biblical foundation for this, Job's friends showed up and they did everything right for the first 7 days they were with him because they sat there in silence and didn't open their mouths. But when they did, they screwed the whole thing up.
yeah.
And for the next 40 some odd chapters, they go back and forth. And, Job has lost literally everything. And he is hurting like these guys have. I mean, they just can't even begin to understand it. And yet they're throwing out these theological principles. Most of them are true, but their timing is horrible.
Right.
And that's what we want people to understand, right? That, there's nothing wrong with offering comfort through a verse of scripture. But think about your timing.
Right.
Not the week of, maybe not even a month later. It might be months later before that's appropriate, but it means you've got to know your friend. And one of the best things, I think you would agree with this, correct me if I'm wrong, show up, offer the gift of your presence, and sometimes just simply silence. Because if your friend who's grieving wants to talk, they will.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I have this little acronym I came up with for what I think people should do in grief. And it is with the word show up. And I feel like the first thing is show up with the S. And I always say, if you're going to show up for me, salty snacks, dark chocolate, that's always helpful, but not necessary. And then H for that is, how are you today? I feel like how are you is such a hard question because it's like, I don't know how I am. And it gets the answer fine more often, or I'm okay. But like, how is today? What does this feel like? I feel like is a really good thing to say.
I agree.
Then O is offer specific help, not like, hey, call me if you need anything. Nobody calls with call me if you need anything, but offer specific help. Like, I'm going to Target. Can I pick you up something? Or can I bring a meal on Thursday? Very specific things are the most helpful, I think. And then W is just words of encouragement. Like especially mentioning our children, like, hey, I loved seeing Paul and I miss him. And, those things, especially with older children that people really were friends with, just hearing their name. And then I say U is use active listening, which is like, just listen. Most people just want to talk about it. And they want an invitation to vent, talk, do whatever. And then P is pray, and I often say, pray that you'll remember to pray. Like, often we say, oh, I've been praying for you. And we're praying for them right as we are talking to them. And I'm guilty of that. So it's not like my prayer life is like hours and days long. But at the same time, just saying, God, help me to remember to keep them in my prayers. And to pray for them and what to pray. And I feel like those are the ways I recommend. This is what's been helpful for me. And I try to remember that as I go through friends who are grieving.
That is so good, Vaneetha. I think is that in your book?
That's in my Bible study. Desperate for Hope.
Okay.
I have that.
Yeah, I think that's worth writing down somewhere. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I want to go back and just highlight something that you just said to people that are listening who maybe it's not you who's lost a child if you're listening today, but maybe a friend has or a family member, and you're not sure about, do I bring up their child's name? Do I ask them about their, what the whole situation? And they're so uncertain. But the answer to that is, for most people, please do ask about their child. I think one of the fears that parents have is that people will forget our child, and their life will not have mattered because people will forget them. Mm-hmm. So please ask. Yeah, I mean, it's fair to ask, what's a favorite memory?
Yeah.
What was a favorite vacation that you guys spent together? It's like music to our ears when we hear someone else use our child's name. It's powerful.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I had people after Paul died who had pictures of him that I had never seen, like they had been at a shower. And I mean, those are like incredible gifts. If you have a picture of somebody's child that they wouldn't have seen, like it's like getting to see them all over again. Like, I don't know if people would understand the power of that, because sometimes I think people would be like, oh, that might feel painful. Any memory of your child is not painful.
No, as a matter of fact, we had to tell people, to bring up our child's name. Mm-hmm. It's not painful. Mm-hmm. When you've experienced the deepest level of pain that we can imagine, saying the name of our child is not going to hurt us. We've already been hurt as badly as we can be hurt. Please take the risk. Mm-hmm. And if for some reason that day we just can't handle it, we'll let you know.
Yeah.
But most of the time, it is indeed music to our ears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say, though, for people who are listening, like, if it isn't a good time, I think you could easily just say, hey, I would love to talk about him or her another time, but today is just hard. Like, that's all you need to say, so you're not feeling like, what should I do? Like, I think people would welcome that too. Like, I would love to talk about them another time, but today the grief is just so hard for me.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's just a matter of being sensitive to what your friend or your family member's going through. Mm-hmm. Just try to read that situation. And you're going to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. It's okay. It's unfamiliar ground to most people. If you are those grieving parents, it's also a place that most of us have never walked before. So we're going to make mistakes too, but hopefully we can offer each other enough grace that we can get through it together and support one another.
Yes.
Yeah. So Vaneetha, something else that I think people who are in a fresh season of grief often wonder is, how long is this pain going to last? Because it just feels completely unbearable. So for you, at what point along that grief timeline did you feel like you began to notice that the acuteness of that pain was becoming more bearable?
I would say for 18 months, I was a mess.
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting though, because I did get pregnant after Paul died. So I had a daughter a year after Paul died, actually. She was born October of 98. But I was still pretty grieving. And so that was, but I would say after 18 months, I was still grieving, but it looked different. It didn't look like I can't, I'm struggling to get out of bed or parent my child. And different seasons, I did different things. Right after Paul died, I painted. I used to be an artist. I painted a whole set of dishes. I did all kinds of,
wow.
I mean, people have called that instrumental grieving. I've heard, like, some people redecorate, they paint, they garden, they build something, because it's a way of processing pain that isn't as direct sometimes. Because when it's too fresh, I feel like I couldn't go at it directly right away. Like, some people can verbalize it, talk about all that's hard. And for me, that was a little too deep to do right away. So I could paint a bull more than I could talk to somebody about what was hard. And so it took me a while to even get out of that place of just instrumentally grieving, making bowls and painting and doing things, and then realizing, okay, there's more to process. And then I ended up, for me, I made an album, which was, I cried through making the whole thing. Because I mean, I got every picture people had and just told a story in this album. And it was hard. And I collected all the notes that people had written us and after the funeral, and kind of booked them into something. And I'm so thankful I did, because now I can open that book rather than opening a bag of letters, which is just hard. Whereas having my favorite ones there, and I open the scrapbook and I can look at them. But those were all parts of my process of grieving. Like I found that scrapbook super healing for me, and it's something I can still pick up now. Whereas I still have a bag of letters that I have never picked up, because it just feels harder for me.
Yeah, it's like a counselor told Kathy and me early on, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. Mm-hmm. There certainly are healthy versus unhealthy ways, but no right or wrong.
Yeah.
And so if finding a hobby and investing time in that hobby helps you, by all means, and you don't have to talk about it initially if it's too painful. You can still process it.
Yeah.
It's just, it looks different for everybody. You know, I do want to give you a few minutes to spend talking a little bit about your book, because that book is, you captured a long period of your life that encapsulated a lot of different forms of suffering. Why did you write the book?
This is Walking Through Fire. My memoir. I wrote it because I wanted people who knew the Lord and people who didn't know Jesus to be able to read it and understand what it felt like sort of inside my life of going through suffering. And so that's why I wrote it. But I also it was really important for me to be real. And a friend of mine talks about how we like to look glossy, like we want it to look pretty, and that we just say, you know, I struggled and I said, praise God, and it just happened. And I found grief is pretty messy on a lot of levels for a lot of things. And I wanted people to know what it's like to suffer and to grieve and to do and say things that you regret, and yet to find God in the midst of that. Because I feel like a lot of people don't want to admit what was hard, or their doubts, or the struggles along the way. And then other people who have those feel like, oh, maybe I'm not a Christian. Maybe I'm not doing this right. Maybe I don't even know God. And I feel like that does such a disservice to people. So I wrote it because I wanted to be real. And I wanted to say, yeah, you can think these things, feel these things, say these things, and keep trusting God. I mean, I feel like the biggest part of the Christian life is just keep going back to God. You can say whatever words you need to, but don't walk away. Don't, you know, and that's like a relationship. Like sometimes you do say hard things, and I'm not saying that it's, I do think there's ways to sin against God in the ways that we can talk to him. But if we do sin against God, we can always confess that. Like it's a relationship with Jesus. And so I would much rather say those things and confess them than to say, I'm not going to say anything and I'm going to walk away because I don't even know God. And so I think there's a balance. And I always say to people, like, draw near, like keep talking. And I wanted to show what that felt like through different seasons of suffering.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And because so many people have this wrong concept of, particularly Christians, I think that, you know, that we have to put on a pretty face for God, and that we can't be honest with him, because if we're honest when we're suffering and in the midst of pain, we're going to say something that we shouldn't say. And then, you know, we're going to regret that, or somebody's going to think badly of us. But I think it is so important to be transparent and honest. I mean, after all, he's omniscient. He already knows we're thinking it. There is no difference in thinking it and sharing it with him.
Right.
And he's the one who created us with all these emotions, so he understands us.
Right.
Jesus experienced grief. He knows what it's like.
Right. And Greg, one of the things you said is we feel like we have to defend God, that somehow other people are going to turn away. And I love the story of Ruth and Naomi for that. Like, Naomi had lost her husband, lost everything, lost her 2 children.
Yeah.
And she said some pretty harsh things. The Almighty has gone out against me. Don't call me Mara, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. And she was very much like, God has done this to me. And yet we see Ruth, who is a Moabite, want to follow her and follow her God. And I think that speaks so beautifully to the fact that the Moabites would never have been able to talk to their God about their God that way. It was all about appeasing their God. So our realness about our pain draws people to God. Like Naomi was so real. And Ruth said, your people shall be my people and your God, my God, because she wanted that God. And so I think the more real we can be with people, they're going to be drawn to our God rather than a God that doesn't care. We can't say anything besides the things that we're supposed to say.
Absolutely. And how do we know what those things are that we're supposed to say? That's just what we think.
Right.
But I think people are looking for transparency and honesty in our culture today. And they want to see how we process things like that.
Right.
So I'm so glad. I think this is an incredible resource. So I would encourage anyone who hasn't to get Vaneetha's book, Walking Through the Fire, and read it. I think it's just an incredible resource. There's something else before we go that I want you to share with our listeners, Vaneetha, and that's about the song that a friend of yours wrote after you lost Paul. Mm-hmm. Instead of me sharing that, I want you to share that with our listeners.
Yeah. So a friend of mine named Krista Wells came over after Paul died, and we had coffee. She brought a meal and started talking about Paul, and we became friends. And she ended up writing a song called Held. And it was recorded by Natalie Grant years later in 2006. But Krista wrote it soon after Paul died. And the song, for those of you who may not know it, it just starts off with 2 months is too little. They let him go. They had no sudden healing. To think that Providence would take a child from his mother while she prays is appalling. Who told us we'd be rescued? What has changed? And why should we be saved from nightmares? We're asking why this happened to us who have died to live. It's unfair. And Krista wrote that because that's how I felt. Like, why am I not being saved from nightmares? And I am begging God, I'm praying. Like, how could God take him? And I think that's often our question is, why aren't we being saved from nightmares? Like, this feels unfair. Yeah. And yet God meets us. And the chorus of that song is amazing. This is what it means to be held, how it feels when the sacred is torn from your life and you survive. This is what it is to be loved and to know that the promise was when everything fell, we'd be held. And that song was, Natalie Grant sings it beautifully. So if you haven't heard it, I would encourage you to listen to it. But it really touched a lot of people with a lot of loss. And speaks to that.
After you and I spoke a couple of weeks or so ago, I went and asked my wife if she was familiar with that song, because she is a huge fan of Natalie Grant. And she was automatically, oh yeah. She said that was an incredible song. So she pulled up a video and played it for me, and I was reading the lyrics as I listened to it. And oh my gosh, is it ever powerful and tender at the same time? Mm-hmm. And Natalie does perform it so beautifully. I can only imagine how many people have been touched by that.
Yeah, it's an incredible song. And
the name of it, if you didn't catch it the first time, is Held, Held. So if you haven't listened, I would invite you to do that. It is beautiful. Please also check out Vaneetha's webpage. She's on Instagram. She's on Facebook. Check out the books and the Bible study and the devotional, and I will have on the description of this episode the links to these various books, and yeah, check them out for yourself. I think they would be an incredible resource to you. Vaneetha Risner, we are so blessed to have had you with us today. It's been such a joy.
Oh, thank you. It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Our privilege and pleasure. Thank you. If you find our podcast meaningful, we invite you to follow us so that you can automatically receive the latest episodes. Also, we'd like to invite you to contact us and talk with us about sharing your story on a future episode, because every story is important and matters to God. Please reach out via email at hope@emptychairendeavor.com. That's hope@emptychairendeavor.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening.